Whenever the household cavalry are turned out en masse for a parade, you'll notice that some of the troopers look a little different from the others. Instead of their swords, they carry large axes with a dreadful-looking long spike at its rear. Sometimes their uniforms are a little different too, like in the lifeguards, where they don't wear the usual bright red tunic and white plume, but have a much darker appearance. So who are these soldiers? Why do they ride separately from the rest of their regiment, and why are they equipped differently? And most importantly, are these distinctions purely historical, or do they reflect some deeper purpose within cavalry life? Well, these are farriers, and far from being a ceremonial distinction, these are arguably the most important people in their entire regiments, not only historically, but even today, at least when we're talking about the regiment's ceremonial horse-mounted functions. And that importance transcends just the British military, really, as anyone who has experience with horses could tell you. Farriery, the trade of a farrier, the art, in fact, of a farrier, is something that goes back to at least a few hundred years before Christ. So what do they do that's so important? Who are these farriers? Well, they shoe the horses. Do I sound a little dramatic here? Well, maybe. I do like being dramatic. But really, as specific as this role is, its extraordinary significance cannot be overstated. A horse without a properly fitted and fixed shoe is far more liable to suffer a foot injury, the likes of which can become quite complicated. Healing a horse's foot isn't so simple as putting it in a cast and giving it a pair of crutches. After all, it really is the most important part of the animal. I mean, they sleep standing up, for goodness sake. We all know what tends to happen, unfortunately, to a horse if it breaks a leg. It's usually considered a mercy when that happens as well. Even more so, you might imagine that in a military environment where if a horse can't keep up or perform its duties, which are hardly going to be light duties, at least back in the day. Ceremonial these days, not quite so much. They're given much better lives. But back in the day, exigencies of the service, as they were called, life was rough for an army horse. And, as they say, the old adage, no hoof, no horse. They're not only fixing, the farriers this is, they're not only fixing the shoes onto the horse, but they're regularly inspecting those shoes to make sure that they're well fitted, that they're not becoming loose, which can result in injury and ultimately even maybe death, at least historically for a horse. And historically, this is especially going to be important on the march. That was a near round-the-clock job. And sort of as a continuance of that, metalworking was also a key component, a key component of farriery work, as they are the ones who are crafting the shoes, often individually to the horse, to make sure that they're going to fit well. They're nice and flush with the hoof and everything. Again, all of this is, whether it's 200, 300, 500 years ago or today, it is exhausting work, physically and mentally draining in many different ways. According to Forces.net, an Army farrier might be working today 9 hours a day as part of a team to shoe some 50 horses a week. And while that is deeply impressive, historically the responsibility would have been even more taxing, as you might only see one farrier with their assistants responsible for over 100 horses on campaign, rather than ones that are only performing ceremonial tasks. And obviously modern farriers have modern equipment and everything as well. On an old school campaign, it's going to be even harder, if you can imagine such a thing. And we'll come back to that right after a brief sponsored message.
Agent 005, lovely you could finally join us.
I wouldn't miss it for the world, Doctor.
Well, listen up, Fab. You're going deep into Italian territory, and it isn't for a grand tour. Word has it the French are getting uppity there. Some chap named Bonaparte.
Nothing I can't handle while looking spectacular and blurring moral boundaries that future generations will find distasteful.
Look here, your kit for the mission. A grapple hook disguised as a bust of Augustus for your entry through the Alps.
Like Caesar on the Rubicon, weedy waney.
Boundary pushing already, I see, Farb. Well, here we have what appears to be any old run-of-the-mill canaletto, but in reality, another grappling hook.
I've always been a fan of carnal etto.
Please stop. Anyways, here we have your horse. It's just a horse. Nothing about that?
Right, Doctor, time is wasting. I'd best be off.
Wait, Farb. There's one last piece you'll need if you're going to reach Bonaparte alive. Exeter's newest, upgraded card holder.
Come now, Doctor, I've never had to pay...
Dear Lord Farb, it's a sponsored segment. Just let me get through my lines.
Right. Sorry.
Thank you. Exeter has always pushed the bar of quality with their sleek, modern wallet designs, and now they've done it without a bit of plastic. Yes, indeed, this upgraded card holder is all recycled aluminium. Even the quick card access button is, and unlike the regular wallets, this one is modular.
Well, I like the sound of that.
Up to 7 cards in the holder itself. Double that under the added plate. And that's not all, Farb. This time it comes with an add-on ecosystem. An AirTag backplate or a finder card, a coin tray, a cash clip even. You can customize your kit for whatever the mission at hand may require. And of course, it comes with a variety of colors for you to select from desert red to midnight blue. Although we all know you're just going to go with the jet black or space gray. Again. And thank our lucky stars, it even comes with a lifetime warranty.
A deft play, Doctor. And thankfully you're just handing me one right now, so I don't even need to worry about purchasing. But, if I were... I'm losing the voice. If I were to purchase it, where might I find it?
Well, you'd visit the link in the description below, of course. And, of course, you'd be sure to use the code BrandonF when you do so. Because even when Exeter has their own separate sales going on, like their Labor Day sale going on now until September 3rd, you'd still be able to get even more savings on top of it with BrandonF. And it's all thanks to Exeter for sponsoring this video. So be sure to thank them on your way out the door.
That's right, this entire bit was just because you can customize the card holder, and I guess it reminded me of like a fancy spy gadget, I guess? I've never seen a James Bond movie. That's all I've got. So, Exeter, great sponsor. You know, thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Go check them out. Let's get back to the video now.
So the chief purpose of the Farrier being to prevent injuries, in this case to the foot, well, you can see how this role naturally came to take on a wide variety of veterinary tasks as well, so that farriers would also be monitoring the animals for other injuries and even sickness, with the general task assigned to them ultimately to bring back any disabled horse to its full strength whenever and wherever possible. Before the advent of modern veterinary care, like late 18th, early 19th centuries, well, they were oftentimes the first and last layers of medical care for the animals which so many armies so desperately relied on. Now, in the past, they were also responsible for certain less desirable tasks relating to the animals, and I don't just mean mucking out the stables. It would be the purview of the farriers to help the quartermaster keep track of all the regiment's horses, which included, when the horse died in battle, the horse's identification, their numbers and regimental ownership and whatnot. It was all often tracked on their horseshoes, that being the most consistent and reliable place to store the information that would never escape the horse, like, say, a document in a saddle might. This meant that when the returns were being made, well, farriers need a way to know which horses fell and to whom they belonged. A lot of times they would just submit the severed hooves to keep track. That's why the farriers carry an axe instead of a sword. It was a tool used to acquire those hooves. And I'm not sure if a horseshoe can be reused, but possibly as well. You can reclaim the metal and whatnot. But the axe is there to basically chop off the hooves, chop off the feet in order to... there's a number of military purposes of why you need to do that. Likewise, unfortunately, the pitiful cries of wounded horses would be all too common a sound after an engagement when it was the farrier with that long spike opposite the axe blade, whose job it was to put the poor animals out of their misery. Now, thankfully, as you might expect, axes are no longer used for those purposes. Just as the troopers themselves have moved beyond using sabers in battle, the axes themselves are purely symbolic. They are a remembrance of the duties of earlier days. But again, the farrier themselves still has a modern day role very much. They're just, they're carrying a bit of equipment that they used to use no longer. But thus far, as I've been speaking in very broad terms about the role, let's narrow things down a little bit. By the early modern era, so we're talking 17th, 18th centuries in this particular case, farriers represented a formal and regulated structure within cavalry regimental organization. They weren't just, contracted labor or local tradesmen being levied up for the job. They were on the regimental rolls, just like how pioneers were for infantry regiments. Now, in the British Army, a cavalry regiment would be divided into troops, the cavalry equivalent to a company, that ranged from, depending on the year and everything, a few dozen to maybe even a little over 100 soldiers. Now, obviously, each one of those cavalrymen was going to have at least one horse, and officers typically would have multiple horses. There was also going to be maybe a few mules to help haul the supplies, and there's going to be certain staff officers. There's always more than obviously just the soldiers themselves. But the point is that is a lot of hooves, right, to take care of, a lot of animals to take care of. Now, each of these individual troops, usually around 8 to 12 troops per regiment, would have a single farrier to care for all of those animals, in which task then they would be aided by private soldiers who are doubling as shoeing smiths, or as they were often referred to, assistant farriers. So again, very similar here to the structure of the infantry pioneers, where you have one specialized role, if you will, per company, and then they're aided by a number of assistants, is a good way to put it. Now, these farriers and their assistants would in turn be overseen by the regimental farrier major, who by the Napoleonic Wars was roughly equivalent in rank to an infantry color sergeant, so basically being a senior NCO. But despite their immense importance, again, without these guys, the regiment literally could not exist. Well, for much of their history, these men were largely uneducated. Prior to the, mid to late 18th century, veterinary science, especially military veterinary science, was not a formalized professional field of study. The farriers were tradesmen. They were highly skilled ones, yes, but they weren't medical professionals in the classic sense. They had no scientific understanding, for example, of the horse's anatomy, or a deeper knowledge of the principles that stood behind the diseases that horses were suffering from. Rather, their ability to maintain and heal the horses was owed to practical experience, practical application alone. Now, there were during this time a wide variety of books and manuals and the like, all discussing farriery practice, as well as, wider horsemanship and horse care and the like. There's information out there and scholarship on it, but like many of the infantry manuals of the day, these were private market books. They were suggestions. These were not military regulations. These were just, X or Y person who may or may not be an expert on this field wrote a book and published it, so you can buy it if you want to, or you can ignore it as just a bunch of hogwash and whatnot. And then, of course, on top of that fact, most of the farriers would be illiterate anyways, and so you might have an exception there for the farrier major, who's going to need to fill out returns and submit reports and whatnot, but most of the farriers aren't going to be able to read those books anyways. That all being said, though, as regular viewers of this channel will be familiar, towards the end of the 18th century, armies were rapidly evolving. They were growing more professional. Likewise, so too was the civil society, and it's around this time, again late 18th century, that we begin to see the first academically professional veterinary schools appearing. First in France, and then spreading across the continent and eventually to Britain from there, while armies were varyingly quick to introduce their graduates into military service. Hate to say it here, but the British were behind the times on this one. It took them until 1796, after a disastrous campaign in the Netherlands, when they needlessly lost thousands of horses, to finally come to terms with the fact that they needed to regulate that a veterinary surgeon would be assigned to every regiment. Now, these were individuals professionally, academically trained in veterinary care, and almost immediately their introduction saw immense improvements to animal welfare, bringing back horses from injuries and illnesses previously deemed incurable by even the most experienced cavalrymen, by that, farrier trade. The introduction of veterinary surgeons also, however, led to some strife from multiple different angles. On the one end, you have the regular army surgeons and army physicians who, they could at times be very protective of their own positions and basically insisted that an animal doctor must inherently be lesser, both in rank and in social privilege, than themselves, the people doctors. While then you have from the other end the farriers. Well, one could imagine how long entrenched farriery practice was, even if it was an outdated practice, even if it didn't always work. Well, it was sometimes difficult for these outsider, newfangled graduates to effect change to, a very old trade, as it were. One role in particular, for example, the farrier major, had good cause to be wary of these new introductions, because before too long, well, their post overseeing the farriers, making sure they're doing their jobs, they know what they're doing, well, that was, in the first instance, mostly subsumed and eventually just outright replaced by these veterinary surgeons. Now, a good way to see how these new roles were able to sweep in and take positions of immense control over a trade literally thousands of years old by that point, might be found in the definition of farrier in a military dictionary that was published 1810 by William Duane, where he describes how troop farriers should be under the immediate superintendence and control of a veterinary surgeon, to whom they ought to apply whenever a horse is ill or lame, that he might report the same to the officer commanding the troop. No farrier should presume to do anything without first having received directions from his superior. You can imagine, a farrier goes and sees horse is suffering from, corns or whatever common thing there might be a problem with, and he just starts doing what he's always done for 20 years, 30 years or whatever in the service to solve the problem, and then all of a sudden some, 25-year-old graduate comes in excuse me, that's not how you do that. Obviously that is a gross exaggeration, but there's going to be some tension whenever you have, a new introduction to especially a military structure that is going to have authority. The dictionary also says that no farrier should make any medicine or any external application contrary to the receipt given him by the veterinary surgeon. So you can't even make up a simple little poultice without getting this guy's permission first. Still though, while these reforms, like every military reform, met with some initial tension, it was overall, I would dare say, for the best. Not only for the horses, but ultimately even for the farriers themselves. Maybe not for the farrier major, but for the farriers as a whole themselves, who received in this a fresh, more academic perspective on their tasks, allowing them to improve their own art while being forced to take on less responsibilities that they ultimately weren't trained for. Basically, it allowed the farriers to better focus on doing their jobs, on being farriers, actually caring for the horses effectively in the way that they are meant to and that they know how to, rather than trying to be something that they weren't, rather than having all these extra veterinary tasks heaped on over them, oh, hey, this horse has a fever, farrier, you have to take care of that. I don't know, that's not what I do. Well, now, thankfully, there's a guy who does know how that works. Although, still, for their part, The administration of veterinary surgeons, incidentally, who also probably learned a great deal of things from active service with military farrier and everything. I'm sure the practice of veterinary medicine obviously benefited a great deal from this sort of thing as well. It wasn't just a one-way street. But in any case, for their part, the administration of these veterinary surgeons, at the regimental level and everything, it was hardly the most efficient. And there would be a lot of blights with that, which perhaps most clearly might be seen in the Crimean War, really extending through the 19th century, but especially in the Crimean War, when even under the purview of veterinary surgeons, well, owing to factors of horrible supply and miscommunication, natural conditions, just outright bureaucratic malpractice, well, once again in that campaign, the British Army, it would be a disaster as far as the horses were concerned, with thousands of losses which might otherwise have been prevented with a more robust administration. It's a whole other topic, more complicated than I can give appropriate attention to here, but oh, how so very convenient that you can read about it in the brand new book, Something Like Philosophy, which is out for sale now. That's right, you've heard me ramble and rant about it for ages, but the book is finally released. 8 articles, all by various amazing authors on a wide variety of different topics, all relating to privation and trauma as it was experienced throughout military history. The specific article about the Crimean War in this case, all now very cheerless, was written by another YouTuber you may know, Daryl Rivers, over from the Ministry for History. I've also got an article in there about the War of 1812, a skirmish during the War of 1812. It's fun stuff. But in particular, that Crimean War article has a little bit about the fate that the horses suffered. It's primarily about a storm, a winter storm, a horrible winter storm that hit the men when they were outside the walls of Sebastopol. Very, very good article. So if you're interested in that, you can find it at nativeoak.org/shop. And hey, remember, 10% of all the profits go to charity at the end of the day as well. So go and look into it down below. Anyways, it was finally in 1880 that another major reform was made to Army animal welfare with the introduction of the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, which in fact is still around today and continues to serve an incredibly important role in, well, Army animal welfare. Now, returning to the farriers themselves, I understand that it might sound like I'm giving them a little bit of bad press, and ultimately when you look at the early modern history of military farriers, and especially through the lens of veterinary medical history, which is how this tends to go, well, things do tend to be pretty negative feeling. But I would argue that that wasn't through any fault of the farriers themselves. These were individuals given an extraordinarily complicated set of tasks which ultimately they weren't professionally trained for. They were highly skilled professionals, yes, but they weren't veterinarians, not in the modern day sense. When we read about how many early modern armies lost such vast numbers of horses to incompetence, as applicable as that term may or may not be, especially in Britain. Britain back in the day apparently was referred to as the hell of horses. That's according to the Trumpet of Glory by Ernest A. Gray. He says that Britain was the hell of horses. Well, even still, when we look back at the way they were being treated by just the farriers and whatnot, well, it's usually through that hindsight of modern medical standards. We have the veterinary corps today. Now we understand how important it is to have it, and so we can look at a time when they didn't and be like, oh, how backwards. But at the end of the day, these men weren't veterinarians any more than a nurse or medical orderly is a surgeon. These roles are all immensely important, and they should be celebrated as such, but we also have to understand that they have their limits. And if you add a different job on top of their already difficult roles, well, you can only expect less than desirable results. You're setting yourself up for a failure. Without the nurses, the doctors wouldn't be able to do their jobs to start with. Without the farriers, the veterinary surgeons wouldn't be able to do their jobs. It doesn't mean that either one of them is like more or less important than the other, but they do rely on one another in that way. Now, I'm not in that field. I've never worked with horses, shocking I know, so I can't really speak all too much about its precise details, but of course there is an awful lot of literature out there on the subject of farriery if you're so inclined, both modern day sources and historical. I mentioned earlier those 18th century manuals and the like. Well, if you're interested in reading any of those, well, I've provided just a few of them as free PDFs at nativeoak.org/library for you to peruse. But suffice to say that to become a farrier in the British Army today, at least a one in the household cavalry, according to forces.net, a soldier needs to have served for at least 2 years before they can even apply for the program, at which point, if they're accepted, they will go through a 3-year training course where they learn, obviously all the tricks of metalworking and fixing the horse's shoes and making sure that they're flush and all that stuff, but they will also learn elements of horse anatomy. They will learn how to diagnose and treat common horse health issues. I would presume as well that they're all literate, unlike back in the day. And I think that's all really interesting because it reflects how veterinary surgery really became integrated with the farrier trade and how these different bodies, the medical veterinarian practices and the more trade farriery arts, how they influenced each other to where the present-day military farrier training really actually looks quite similar to what once was only the purview of the surgeons. They have fed off of and made each other better. So by the end of it, like I said before, the role of the farrier was not replaced by the advances of medical standards and science and training and the like, but rather it was enhanced by them to become even more integral to the regiment. The farrier, to put it simply, is today and has always been, though in varying capacities admittedly, right at the heart of the cavalry tradition. Just as no hoof means no horse, no farrier means no regiment. And that, my dear viewer, is why the farriers of the cavalry well deserve their places of distinction both on parade and off of it. Thank you all for watching, especially to those noble supporters of the Native Oak on Patreon, without whom I would not be able to do any of my work. If you'd like to learn more about the Native Oak, what we do, why it all matters, well, please do visit the website, nativeoak.org, and until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.